Okay, so if you watch the video, you kind of get the idea of cohort effects. So we don't really know, um, what's going on in addition to age. Especially one example might be, say you were to looking at something to do with money or attitudes towards money. Well, I mean, that could certainly change due to along with age, right? So obviously, a fifth-year-old is going to think differently about money than, say, a 30-year-old, right? That's true, but when you're looking at that as a um, cross-sectional design, I mean, it could be the difference in age that's going on, or it could be a cohort effect, right? So people born in, say, like the 20s, I think that was when the Great Depression was. I'm not sure though. Maybe that was the 40s. I'm not sure. So that could be a big factor. I think like 60s were not too bad, and then the 80s were pretty prosperous. So again, that's where attitudes towards money could be very different because of the age that they grew up in. It could have a lot to do with it, more so than well, age-related differences. Right? Could be when they grew up or when they were born, or you know anything that goes along with that. So that's what we mean by cohort effects. Okay. On the other hand, we have longitudinal designs. Now, age is again examined within subjects. Same participants are studied at several different times when there are different ages. It's going to be a single cohort. And it's, again, a pain in the butt because it takes a long time, but that's might be worth it. So here's what that looks like again. Um, you're just going to have the same person, or rather the same group of people, say born in 2004, test them when they're 2, test them when they're 4, again when they're 6. If you wanted to group people more broadly by a range of ages, well, you test people when they're in their 40s, when they're in their 60s, and when they're in their 80s. Okay. Now, a longitudinal design is necessary when you're looking at something, some sort of thing that needs to, or not needs to, but um, you're looking at stability over development. So if I wanted to know how do people's personalities change with time, are you going to have, say, the same personality, say the same level of extroversion or introversion when you're 4 compared to when you're 10, compared to when you're 20 or 30 or 40? Well, in that situation, I kind of need to use a longitudinal design, right? Because I need to know what, there's no way you could really look at that in a sectional design because you need to know what your personality is at the start. Right? You really are interested in how does it change over time. So you of course need to measure it over time. If I find that you're, say, very extroverted when you're 6, well, my question is, are you going to be that extroverted or more, even more extroverted 10 years after, or 20 years after, and so on and so forth? I need to know what your basic personality is at the start or wherever I start measuring. Another example would be IQ. So if I wanted to know how does IQ change over time, well, I'd want to measure the same person as they grow up, right? Because I want to see how does their IQ change with age, right? I mean, with IQ, it is, you could possibly do that as a cross-sectional design, but it would just be very messy, right? Because I mean, you could compare 20-year-olds to 10-year-olds and see, look at the change in IQ. But again, because IQ can vary a lot, that's gonna make it messy, right? It's gonna add a lot of extraneous variables, mainly people's actual IQ, right? But yeah, something like personality, you definitely know. If you wanted to know is it stable or is IQ stable, then you definitely need to use a longitudinal design. Okay? Um, And then also, when you want to test hypotheses about sequences and development, and those sequences can be, don't so much occur, they can vary in terms of what age they occur, but we know that one comes before the other. then you want to use a longitudinal design. So, for example, if you need to understand that people get object permanence before they understand um, abstract thinking, and so remember, object permanence is the idea that if you remove something, people can't see something, do they still know it's there? Right? And young children, if you take something out of sight, they think it doesn't exist, right? Because they don't understand object permanence. Abstract thinking is thinking of things not necessarily in without necessarily concrete terms, such as something like a math equation. Well, if I wanted to know whether, say, um, object permanence comes before understanding abstract thinking, well, that would again have to be longitudinal design because I'd have to look and see across a whole bunch of children, when do they develop object permanence, and then does abstract thinking come after that? That would be very messy and tricky to do with a cross-sectional design. Okay, now longitudinal designs, you can't really say there's causation there either because they're confounded with when you test someone, right? So the year you test them minus the year they were born is going to be their age, obviously. But the year you test them is also going to vary with their age, right? So if I'm testing, the same person, um, or again, the same group of people at 2, 4, and 6, I'm also testing them at different times, right? And I mean, that does capture age, but it could capture a lot of other things too, right? So I'll give you an example of this as well. So let's say you were looking at extroversion, so your tendency to want to engage with other people. Um, does that change with age? Maybe do you become more extroverted with age? Well, that's certainly possible, but also keep in mind that, you know, you might be testing them at different times, meaning a lot of things could be going into whether they're extrovert or not. Are they meeting new people? Are they um, in a different environment, maybe a new school environment that could affect their extroversion? And it's not really some age, but say what year of school they're in. Right? That would be an example of a confound that occurs with year of testing. Um, yeah, like I said, year of testing, that's going to be a confound when you look at things at different ages, or sorry, look at the same people at different ages. But then again, cohort effects are going to be confounded with testing different people of different ages, right? Sorry, this is the cohort one. This would be year of testing. I kind of gave the answer away, but think about it again. Try and remember. So in a cross-sectional design, age is confounded with either cohort, year of testing, or both. Well, it's going to be cohort, right? Like we said, in looking at an example with, say, attitude towards money, age is confounded with when they were born. Maybe they were born during the Great Depression or during a prosperous time. That's going to vary along with age, right? Because you're comparing different people. Those people were born in different years, and that can come up with a whole host of things. In contrast to longitudinal design, age is confounded with testing because you're testing the same people multiple times. Well, you have to wait for their age to change. So of course, when you test them, it's going to be a confound, right? Um, so just kind of go over this again because I want you to be clear about this. I mean, are 40-year-olds born in the 60s, are they the same as 40-year-olds born in the 20s? I mean, to some degree, but probably in a lot of ways not. What about today's 2-year-olds? Are they the same as 2-year-olds that were born 4 years ago? Maybe. that's kind of another thing to consider, right? Is again like how much of an age spread are you looking at? I mean, if you're talking about a very big difference in, you know, um, cohorts, well, they're from very different, they grew up during very different times. So maybe that's a problem. Whereas if it's only a difference in a couple of years, maybe there's going to be less of a difference. Again, it all just kind of depends on your study. Um, something like some sort of social attitude, like we again gave the example of attitudes toward money, that could vary a lot depending on when you were born or when you grew up, right? There could be a substantial cohort effect when it comes to your attitude towards money. Is there going to be a cohort effect, say, your memory ability? Probably not. Probably fine, right? I mean, there might be a bit of difference, but chances are our memories haven't really changed. If you were born in the 20s versus the 60s, is your memory really that different? Not the things you might remember, but just kind of the way your memory functions. I wouldn't think so. So in that example, it'd probably be fine. The memory example probably be okay to use a cohort or a cross-sectional study because there probably aren't cohort effects. Whereas again, something like say attitudes toward money, that could vary quite a bit by cohort and not by age. So then maybe you do want to use a longitudinal design. But again, we want to be aware with longitudinal designs that because you're testing participants repeatedly, you have to be worried about all the things that can happen when with repeated testing, right? So things like participant mortality, people dropping out in a systematic way, practice effects, um, fatigue effects, probably not, but definitely practice effects, right? So let's say you run some sort of cognitive test as a longitudinal design. Say you look at some sort of memory test or a reaction time test. Well, practice effects could definitely show up there, right? And you can't really counterbalance it, but if you do it when you're 2 and then you're going to do it when you're 4, I mean, is it age that matters, or is it just the fact that this is your second attempt at doing the experiment, whatever that might be? Could be a practice effect, right? So and then there was a bunch more that you can review on your own. But yeah, just remember all those historical effects like we talked about. So is there something that goes on independent of development? Like say there's you know, a tragic event or whatever that could certainly impact attitudes or behavior. So bear all those things in mind. All those things can show up when you're dealing with longitudinal studies. Um, Last thing to think about with a uh, longitudinal design is that your results may or may not generalize to other cohorts. So because you have only one cohort, you do want to think about um, whether that same finding is going to apply to the larger population. If you're looking at applying this to anyone developing and you're saying, oh, this is the case with all ages, or not all ages, but um, all people that change from this age to this age. Well, when you only have a single cohort, that might affect your validity, right? Maybe you don't have a very representative sample and your external validity can really suffer. Right? Maybe you can't generalize it to other cohorts because you just have one. The last thing you can do is known as the cohort sequential or longitudinal sequential design. This is really just combining the two techniques. So um, basically, you're going to run both a cross-sectional and a longitudinal study together. And you can test for, but not necessarily eliminate cohort and time of testing effects. So if I'm looking at some sort of experiment or some sort of study, it's not an experiment because it's developmental. Um, this would be longitudinal. This would be, or sorry, I lost my train of thought. Um, sorry, this would be a sequential design. So basically, again, you're testing the same people multiple times, but you're also testing different cohorts. Right? So I might get people who were born in 2004, 2006, and 2008, and they'll also serve as um, my 2-year-olds that I'm going to test, my 4-year, but they'll also serve as my 4-year-olds and my 6-year-olds. So you're having different cohorts and you're testing people repeatedly. Okay. So it's longitudinal and it's cross sectional. Now, as you can probably imagine, this is a real pain in the butt, right? Sorry. I mean, you could definitely argue that maybe um, it's just more trouble than it's worth. Like, if you can run this with a cross sectional design, why not just do that? Or you can run this as a longitudinal design. Maybe you want to do that. Doing both obviously requires kind of the bigger sample and different age ranges of a cross sectional design, but it also requires the time of a longitudinal design. But again, depending on your study, that might be worth it. Because the big advantage here is that you can look for cohort effects and you can look for time of testing effects. So basically what that looks like is if you can compare and basically find the effect cross-sectionally and you can find it longitudinally, well then that would suggest it's not a time of testing and it's not a cohort effect, right? Because you're showing it both ways. And yeah, and you can analyze for different cohorts. So if this 6-year-old, if this person when they're 6, I know we deal with more people obviously, but this is just an example, is showing a different pattern than someone from this um, this cohort, but you're comparing them both when they were the same age, are showing differences. Well, then that suggests a cohort effect, right? If this person is different from this person when you test them, that could be a cohort effect, right? Okay. Um, that's it for developmental design. So, and then last, I think our last unit is ethics.